everyone. Welcome back. I'm Melanie Perry from Beyond Clean. Today has already been such an incredible day of learning and some very thought-provoking discussions and conversations. Thank you all for being engaged with today's presentations and our speakers. As a reminder, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll find many downloadable documents that have been provided for you by our event sponsor and speakers. You will also find bonus CE content provided for you by Beyond Clean. Our next speaker is here to keep this day of education rolling. Jeff Wertz is the Vice President of Product and Business Development at Sergio Health, where he designs and delivers innovative modern technology and data to improve surgical logistics for healthcare facilities. Having spent his early career years as a medical device rep, Jeff is passionate about drawing on his firsthand experience to apply novel technology solutions to identify and improve the needs of healthcare facilities. As our vendor management expert, Jeff showcases his experience and expertise to help departments implement a successful vendor management system. Joining Jeff for today's session is special guest Dan Whetten. Dan is the Vice President of Optimization at Sergio Health. In his role, Dan helps clients identify and implement best practices and optimize technology across their delivery network. He is zealous about empowering and elevating teams to higher levels and does so in his work as an independent consultant. He works hand in hand with hospitals on structure, workflow, and optimization of supply chain and sterile processing departments. Get ready to join Jeff and Dan in a discussion surrounding data in SPD. Here are the actionable steps you can use to help improve accuracy, efficiency, and create a culture of continuous improvement in your sterile storage area. Is your sterile storage area set up for success? Let's find out now. Let's welcome Jeff and Dan.
Thanks, Melanie.
All right, thank you.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, I think you need to turn your video. There you are. Yeah. All right, you guys, take it away.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it for us. So, Dan, I know how zealous you are to get going here. Great choice of language on the bio. So excited to have another input and someone else for people to listen to, because I couldn't get through all this on my own. So our objectives today around the data of sterile storage excellence are establishing a foundation of organization and workflow for you. You can't get data if you don't have a good, solid foundation that everyone is following from a process standpoint. Our second objective is evaluate and optimize with that data. And then our third is really continuous improvement. So not becoming complacent with the data that we're collecting, finding new ways to evolve and adapt and come up with new opportunities for improving your department overall. So starting off with that, on the point of establishing a foundation of organization and workflow, really, I look at this whole space, and when I first talked with the Beyond Clean team around this, I get really fired up in the fact that I go through grocery stores, grocery stores and Target, all these different places, treat their inventory like it's very, very valuable. And everyone knows the different shelves, the value of those shelves and the placement. And from a hospital perspective, it always blew my mind that, we're in the OR, we can't find anything, and they're not looking at it from the same perspective. And I always thought that it'd be very interesting to kind of shift that perspective and place that inside of the healthcare setting, because realistically, the value of the real estate within a hospital is far more valuable than in these marketplaces. So the way I viewed it is really looking at your customers and the clinical departments similar to the way that the grocery stores might. So looking at your inventory, how OR and OB, everyone is really your clients in that regard. So instead of maximizing the profitability as a grocery store, let's look at how we can maximize the deliberate layout of that inventory, understanding the costs associated with these things. How much does it cost to get it into that placement? How much is it costing for your team to handle those items? Understanding the value of each of those items. So how much do they cost? Where are the most important components placed, and being able to communicate that with the OR team and the leaders of your hospitals. and then how you are continuously measuring it and evaluating it over time, because the health of your business really does depend on it, just as it does for supermarkets and those locations. So just kind of shifting your perspective at the beginning is kind of the way that I wanted to get things kicked off here. So to dive into the organization and standardization component, I'm going to really kind of kick some of this off over to Dan here shortly, because this is where he really shines. But from what we're looking at here is, to be successful, you have to have that sound strategy in place. So what we're going to really run through today is talking about kind of floor plan layout, item organization, and tracking. And what we also want to make sure that we're getting across, and feel free to ask questions for us at the end, but understanding, we have a good understanding that each hospital is a little bit different. So everyone's experiencing different challenges. So we're going to try to give kind of bite-sized opportunities to implement it. So one place to start, I always speak to crawl, walk, run. So giving you ideas on how you can crawl to get to that point, and then start getting more efficient with it and have bigger aspirations, and then the kind of most advanced view of that. So from a floor plan perspective and organizing and standardization, I'll kick it over to you, Dan, to speak to how you view this space.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. So I think it's not uncommon. There's certain departments in a hospital setting that tend to get what's left over. And what I mean by that is, in a lot of cases, you have your sterile processing departments, your supply chain departments, EVS, and nutrition. These all tend to get whatever space is left at the end of the day, right? And so we don't always have a choice as to where our storage is, where the layout of our department, because sometimes there's weird corners and beams in the middle of it. We're usually in the basement. So when I talk about floor plan and layout, really what we're looking at is, how can we find the smoothest flow with what we're given? How can we find the smoothest flow when it comes through how things flow through our department? So where our carts are staged, where our sterile storage is, where our loose clean instruments are placed, where our assembly is. I've seen some places that have their pill packs are on one end of the building and their assemblies in another. I've seen it where assemblies on a different floor from their washers. There's a lot of different layouts. And so one of the first pieces is, because everyone is unique, you want to find the most optimal flow for your goods, if you will, coming through the department. You want to find the most optimal flow, and then identify the key, since we're talking about data, the key thresholds that you want to capture so you can measure that flow as it goes through. And we're going to get more into that here in a little bit. So that's kind of the floor layout and how that's structured. You want, because there's a life cycle to the trays, comes through decontam, some has to go through your sonic, some has to go straight to hand washing, then it goes into the cart washer or the other washers, then it needs to go right into assembly. There's a flow to it, and you want to close those gaps between those steps as much as possible. So we want the layout to be optimal to close those gaps so that you have less disruption to your staff. Item organization. So within our item organization, we're talking about really having the right stuff.
Sorry, Dan. I jumped ahead on a slide there. I think to exactly what you're talking about there, from a standard operating procedure for the different workflow that you were discussing about how you're going through different steps, being critical that you have established what your standard operating procedures are for those facilities. So I think that's where you're going through establishing what the critical points are, and making sure that everyone in your department is aware of what those expectations are and what that flow should be overall. Absolutely.
And then organization standards. So the location, I think we've kind of touched on some of this.
Sorry.
So just like, no, you're good. I need to move it along too. So the location of your supplies, and kind of to Jeff's example at the first with the grocery store, right? They have the most high use, most valuable items at the perfect height and level for people in the grocery store. Well, it shouldn't be any different when you come to your supplies and that structure and organization. You really want your high volume items to be closest to the point of use, right? You want to make sure that you are eliminating as much travel as possible. And that, you know, your heavier sets, you don't want them up over your head. You know, we want to make sure that the actual build is correct. It takes data to do that. We need to know what your highest movers are, and we're going to get into some of that here in a little bit. The other piece is owned, consigned, park loaners. We need to understand what supplies belong to who and where, so we know how to manage those supplies. And I don't know if you wanted to add more to that or not, Jeff.
Yeah, I think in what we're talking about right now is really where we're placing those, right? So looking at just getting to the point where we can start evaluating from a data standpoint, but again, that standard level of procedural expectation for the staff. So making sure that anyone that's coming in off the street can jump in and kind of intuitively understand what the flow is and where things belong. I know, like, you know, to your point with the owned consigned inventory and those park loaners, from a vendor perspective, you know, kind of working with the vendors in some capacity of giving them some space to put their things and have expectations on upkeep, always made things easier at a lot of the facilities that I would work at from a vendor perspective. Being able to have like a cart that I would have all my trauma implants on, and then always putting it back into the same spot. Kind of a similar idea, I think, of what you're going through there, of even if everything breaks down and the system isn't working, or you don't have access to that people have an idea of where things are located based on frequency of use or the department or the rooms that are primarily using that equipment.
Yeah, and I think, and that leads right into kind of the color coding piece that we have on here. One of the neat things that we've been able to do and seen across the country is where you will take certain either categories or vendors, and like the luggage tag, you know, a lot of people will take their count sheets and they'll tape it to the handle. Others will actually put their label on a luggage tag, and you color code those. And some of the things for these visual cues, because not everyone's running around with an iPad or a laptop to identify stuff, is if you have a wall and all of your ENT on that wall is pink, and you have a urology item and that label is yellow, as you're walking in, you know, to find stuff, as you're walking against that wall, you go, why is there a yellow label? It just stands out. So it helps. Yeah. It helps with flow and organization, and data can help us get to that and make sure we're tagging stuff correctly. There's a lot of, it really needs to work in sync. And you tag your vendor stuff one color, and it really allows people to visually connect with what the data is telling them as well.
Yeah, and I think that's important also if you're within a large health system and you have different people coming from different hospitals. If you have these same processes implemented, it's important to have a kind of manual process that does one part of it, and then on the other side of it, having that follow through or visualized within the software component as well. So I think that having both of those pieces is really critical, especially for how fast paced a lot of the environment is when they're looking for items in sterile storage. So from an inventory placement standpoint, when you're kind of re-sequencing these different departments, you want to talk about some of the strategies that you use for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to inventory placement, right, you want to make sure that you're rotating your stock so that the maintenance of your instrumentation is maintained, so that it's consistently used. Some stuff doesn't sit forever. If it's lubricated, you don't want that to gum up a little bit. When it comes to the way we organize the actual inventory itself, one of the issues that, and if you're on the administration side of this, delays to cases, those kind of things are very impactful financially when it comes to an organization or the sterile processing team. If you have, for example, holes in a wrapper, it delays the case, and or now you were already busy, now you've got to reprocess a set you'd already done. So a lot of the organization and structure, it's visual cues when you're looking for stuff that'll tie with the data, but you also want to make sure that you are building out your department in a way that it's conducive to maintaining the integrity of what you're working with. So I've been in facilities where I've seen heavy ortho sets that are stacked 7 high on top of each other on the shelf. There is no way that that's making it in a clean way to the OR. So a lot of this layout, while it might take a little more space, if you can present, and part of this is, or it's 2-part to your administration team, the need for the space to adequately store the supplies actually saves money where you're not delaying cases and have to reprocess items. So first in, first out, I think we kind of understand that rule. You want to make sure that your stuff is organized and rotating. One of the things that gets some attention, but it kind of atrophies, is loose instrument organization. And this one's kind of interesting because as your team is in assembly, and if there's an item that was missing or damaged, for them to go find something to replace it can be very impactful on a timeline. They've got to go dig through old bins and pegboards and find it. If that stuff isn't structured and organized, your productivity actually drops while they're trying to find these items. So when you're looking at organizing your location, and if your software allows you to bin locate items, you want to make sure that you can do that so you can efficiently get what you need, get back to a assembly, and move your process through. So in a way, I guess, oh, go ahead, Jeff.
No, yeah. I was just going to back up and touch on the first in, first out piece, because that's something that I always kind of ran into from a rep standpoint. I just want the quickest thing there, and it's a lot of times the first one on top. So I think there's strategies that people can implement of, the idea of the first in, first out, just for, I have to do this every time in my brain also to make sense of it, is that first item that ended up on the shelf there, that ends up, and then you add other pieces onto it, that you're grabbing that first item out. So that a lot of times they're stacking it up, and then it's last in that gets pulled to go into the OR. And realistically, you want to kind of reverse that, is when you're putting those on. I always try to remind myself to do it of, all right, I got a new setup and it's ready. I'm going to put it underneath the last set that I was using. So I think that's a big component, especially if you're managing implants that are expirable, making sure that you're training people along those lines, because once you get into the data of it and start evaluating it, and you have a system set up where you can monitor expiration, things like that, that's critically important from a patient safety piece, but also utilizing your equipment and seeing the turns around those. Because I think a lot of times if you keep doing that same process, they end up further behind the shelf, and then you don't even realize that you have 5 others of them sitting back there, and you think that you're short on inventory, and you end up buying more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe to add a little color to this, I kind of look like this as you need to run it like a franchise model. For any of those of us that had that privilege of working at a Burger King or McDonald's, you are instructed to build the item the same way every time, and it becomes natural to do that. And one of these things is, as we look at storage and organization, we need to ingrain those habits or hard code those habits to do that rotation. Just to give a small personal, for those of us that, or those of you that want a real life example in your home life, I'll give you one for me just to lighten it up a little bit. A couple days ago, I went in and I looked at my sock drawer and I said, honey, I really need some new socks. And she said, well, if you just dig beyond that, you have 12 new pair right below the old ones you keep putting on. So I hadn't rotated my socks. Same thing with your instrument sets. You want to rotate them. Had plenty of new ones. Didn't realize they were even there because the old ones just getting put right on the top. So same thing with your instrumentation. Rotate the inventory, but hard code those processes and those habits into the teams, because your data is going to work very well. It'll highlight where that's not happening as we get to scan points and stuff we're going to talk about in a minute. But you really want to hard code and ingrain these habits into the team so this starts to run smoothly.
Yeah, that's a great point, great analogy there. And that I'll think of the sock drawer each time I'm thinking of FIFO from now on.
Right.
So I think to that end, I mean, we wanted to make sure that we covered these for everyone, because having these habits set early on, and just, I've referenced it for a long time now, and want to give a shout out to the book called Atomic Habits, talking about how you build the right processes in place with small little pieces. It's getting these small, good habits in place is absolutely critical to being able to leverage the data in the long term, because our end goal with this is that you have a good process in place that's reliable, and that they're not skipping through the different steps, which is going to be required. Any system that you're going to implement, there's going to be scan points for all of this. So getting them used to it is can't be understated. So when we look at the tracking component, because this is getting into where my space is, I'm working on with Sergio and Dan and I have done a number of these implementations for getting them up and on tracking, even if they're coming from nothing, is just getting from, all right, we've got it sterilized, let's at least get it to put away. So we've gone through all the decontam, assembly, washers, all those different pieces, and sterilization, but now let's get it to put away, because this is gonna start giving us more details on where it was put away to. Any information is better than no information. So knowing it's out of the sterilizer is good, but knowing when it got put away can help you get more details on the throughput of getting that item to sterile storage. So, one of the methods to do that is at least having maybe a scan point when they get up off the elevator to that sterile area, or anything along those lines that's going to be able to say, hey, these items have been put away. Anything that you'd add to that, Dan? I don't mean to put you on the spot with that, but is that pretty sufficient with what you look at from a phase one standpoint?
Absolutely.
All right.
You're spot on.
So from a phase two, what we start looking at is getting a little bit more isolated. So if you have items that are going to multiple different places, imagine you have an ortho room, and then you also have a spine room for sterile storage, is isolating to those different locations so that you can at least know, all right, it's a little bit closer to where it's actually going to be. It doesn't require quite as many scans maybe for every single one of these items, and if you don't have the equipment with you. Those are some of the challenges that we're trying to overcome by giving this crawl, walk, run here. But then ultimately where you want to end up, and I know where Dan's implemented a lot of his facilities, is really down to a bin location and exactly this is on this aisle, on this shelf, in this exact bin, so that people know exactly where to look. There's par values associated with those things, and really is the gold standard for tracking these different items. And then they're also putting the new socks up in front there. So from there, that's really getting through the foundational stuff, what's required to get to the point of where you can start utilizing the data. Because now once we have those things in place, we can actually start evaluating and optimizing it. So what we want to look at from here is how do we start evaluating it? What are some of the strategies that we can take for it? So I'm going to talk about turns evaluation, how we can cut some of the fat out of this process, so we can actually evaluate overutilization, underutilization, when to consign versus loan. Like, these are just some of the concepts that we have. This is suggestions, and you can come up with more. I'd love to hear more ideas that you might have out there of what have been successful for your facilities. But so consign versus loan, throughput, and then some ABC analysis. So let's run through the turns evaluation. And, I'm using the phrase turns evaluation. That just really kind of comes from, mostly where I've seen it is a lot on the manufacturing side. Cycles is another way of saying it. It's essentially just how many times these trays are getting processed over a standard period of time. And I'm actually very eager on this one to hear our audience's experience with this. So, from our data team, and what we're looking at is what's an expected number of turns that's reasonable for a set, because there's so much variation in this of trauma sets and how many you want to have. So it's more of an art form that has to be discussed with your OR and the clinical team to make sure that they're comfortable with the amount that you have. And if it's not being turned a lot, that they're comfortable having that ride on your inventory, because it's costing money either way. So looking at overutilization, underutilization of that, seeing if they're turning more than enough. A lot of this goes back to kind of block times. In our experience with this, you have a day for ortho where all of the knee guys are coming in. So you have a huge amount of sets ultimately, when realistically, if you could talk with the clinical team and have them space it out a little bit, maybe Tuesdays wouldn't be so frantic. So I think that's where we want to start looking at that and have that conversation with the clinical team on what is a reasonable amount of this, because those sets are not inexpensive. Have you had any experience with that, Dan? I think I just rolled through that without pulling your input.
No, you're good. I was going to share, one of the scenarios that I think stands out that we found is we had two ortho docs, and they both had their own trays, right? There's specials the doctor specials, right? I think those exist everywhere. And what was really interesting is they never had enough sets. but one operated Monday, one operated Tuesday, and they couldn't seem to turn their sets fast enough. Well, when we did an evaluation, what we realized is one of the doctors said if we added one instrument to one of the physician's set, he had 3 sets, and the other had 3 sets that were customized. If we added 2, I think it was like 2 different instruments to each set, it actually equated to 6 now sets to do the same thing. And the fight back and forth between the physicians, it went away because now they had enough sets. They didn't have to do same day turns and all those things that clunk up and clog the pipe in sterile processing. So that's one of those optimization stories that I like, that we did just a couple little tweaks and gave us a lot more freedom.
Yeah, and I think that goes to kind of the overall message we want to get here is all this information you can start accumulating, and then it's critical for you to share that with your clinical teams and hospital leadership. The more that you dig in and collect this information and start working with it, I think the more it shouldn't add to legitimacy, because everyone should see SPD as a completely legitimate department. But when you start pulling this information in and show that you're kind of trying to be a student of it, it's going to add to their participation in that and their more willingness to kind of work with you when issues do arise, because I know that you're giving it your all and you're trying these different things out. So another strategy that, I mean, this one's near and dear to my heart, because I always thought it was kind of crazy how, I got my manufacturer to give me consignment. It was really just around, squeaky wheel gets the grease was the approach that we take. If I bugged my ops manager enough, I could probably convince them to let me get a tray consigned at a facility. And there was never much pushback from the facility. So I think taking a closer look at that with your vendors is really critical. It's a great opportunity to partner with them, tracking the number of times that it comes in, to see if it's necessary. Are we at risk for having all these loaners come in, or is it a helpful piece? And I think the main goal of it being loaners is you aren't using them that much, but they are needed from time to time. And I think having an eye on that type of stuff and working with your vendors on right sizing it can help both sides out very significantly. So you're trying to make sure that you're not waiting the last minute for these sets, but working with them to see what really makes sense, and then maybe including the surgeon in that as an early dip your toe into the surgeon discussion, so that they can see, holy crap, we're bringing in this many sets for my cases every week. Well, that would probably give them some pause if they know that it's always kind of up in the air going into it. Because we've seen, I saw some of the data from our system recently that somebody's bringing in a tray 21 times in a month. And just from that alone, I mean, Dan, you said it earlier, there's 20 days in a month, you're bringing in every single day of 20 working days, excuse me, to clarify that. But why are we continuing to wait for the vendors for that, or putting it back onto the vendor to constantly move that around so much? So
I think if I can add to that,
Jeff, you see, please.
Yeah, one of the things that I'd like to add to that is one of the things that for those that are working in SPD, you'll hear this, because those trays that bounce between you and the competing hospitals in a geographical area, you'll need that for a 7:30 case start. But the rep says, I can't bring this to you till 8 o'clock tonight because I'm still using it at a hospital down the street. And so what that does is that really impedes your ability to deliver to your customer. And I think that as you build the data and you work with your physicians and your leadership teams, you really can start pushing back on the vendors a little bit as well and saying, hey, we're going to help you get justification for why we need your company to let you consign some sets with us, because of the delays and the headaches. If you get 35 vendor trays dropped off at 9 p.m. for 7:30 starts, you've got a problem on your hands. And we all know that this happens constantly. So this will allow you, the data associated with this stuff will allow you to tell a story, to get buy-in from leadership team and physicians, to help push the reps and their companies to provide additional sets. And this really allows you to be more efficient in your department and run smoother, so you can really handle those real true emergencies that come. If you've got a consistent flow and sets on the shelf that you need when you need them, then when an anomaly comes in, you can handle that in an appropriate way. That's all I wanted to
think
add to
that. Absolutely correct. And from a vendor perspective, I knew the facilities that had it running, very efficiently. And you end up trying a little bit harder from a rep's perspective too. If you know that they are on the ball, you want to be on the ball for them, and give them the heads up when those anomalies do happen, because it's, we all know that they're going to continue, but the more solid process and information that you have, the better off you're going to be and prepared for those. So looking at throughput here, so what throughput is essentially evaluating the amount of time that it's taking to process that inventory. So I know we're talking about sterile storage, but it doesn't get sterile if you don't have some efficient throughput of getting it to that point. So we look at it as a great KPI, at least measuring from decontam to sterilizer. So again, let's crawl here. I think a lot of facilities have different requirements for scan points. And I think making it as a baseline expectation, everyone knows you have to do sterilizer because that's required. From a JCO perspective, you have to have that scan point. But including something like decontam, so the start point of when somebody was in there getting that inventory, making it available. In an ideal world, you get all the way up to when it got out of the OR, when the procedure finished, and how long it's taking to get all the way through. But let's at least start with a crawling here where we have everyone scanning everything into decontam, and then sterilizer is the immediate throughput there. And then we can also get to the point where if we also have that scan point of put away, then we actually see when people are putting those pieces away. So this is a really good, I think, starting point for many facilities to get to, because then you can also start measuring that time period of how long that's getting to, and start working with your staff for continuous improvement on setting those KPIs that you want with the facilities or with your teams. I know you've done some of these strategies around this, Dan, on looking at that throughput. How do you kind of implement that or introduce it to organizations?
Yeah, one of the things that's it's really interesting with this, until we really had and started digging into data at some of these facilities, it's amazing how data, as you start tracking this, will actually highlight where your bottlenecks are in your process. And some of the kind of eye-opening pieces is we actually were able to identify where bottlenecks hit. We thought it was over at assembly is where we were clogged up in one scenario. And actually it was in decontam is where the bottleneck was. And we had plenty of sinks, had plenty of workforce, but because of the sequencing of events of when they put the people in what spot, it clogged the whole pipe. So for us, being able to see, okay, when did the case leave the OR? And if it sits for too long, obviously you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to put, something on it to keep it wet, forever wet, or whatever product you're using. But it can't sit too long, because if it sits too long, then it's also harder to clean, which takes more time. You need to have the resources and the staff in the right spot to catch those cases. So sometimes first thing in the morning, what we found is if we had all of our staff before the cases started coming down first thing in the morning, the dirty case carts, we had everyone hit the assembly tables kind of like a blitz. And as the case carts started to come down, we would slowly migrate the people from assembly to decon to keep up with the carts. And it was really interesting that the data allowed us to see what those break points were and when we had to start shifting staff. And departments went from always being behind and trying to catch up to actually keeping up, and then zeroing out every night. And not zeroing out with cases for the next day. I mean, everything was up on the shelves, which was really neat. And this is going through pandemic times. They had half the staff and were still able to keep up. So really interesting how this data will help you guide your department.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So the kind of last one that we want to run through from an idea of how you can start evaluating the inventory is kind of an ABC analysis. Understanding the value of the assets. So the actual monetary value of these. I mean, I think you guys all know, like Da Vinci arms, things like that are very, very expensive for the hospital. Scopes obviously being one of those pieces, but also understanding kind of the safety value of some of these things. So like your priority trays. And the reason for this is of understanding those categories of it is so that you can kind of speak to that more so. So if you're talking with the C-suite or the clinical teams, it's going to catch your attention more if you're talking to them about having issues with sterilizers and speaking to the high dollar items or high value items that are going to be top of mind for them. So having that knowledge of that space and working with your clinical team to understand what are most important to them, again, is just showing that you're working with them and in understanding their their mindset, and can get you more resources in the long term, or just help a better working relationship between the two departments. So there's a number of different ways of kind of identifying those and making sure that the staff are aware of them as well, through, if you want to do color coding or some sort of stickers, but also, within tracking systems, being able to categorize them as different high value items, but understanding where the most valuable equipment is, and then also how you're going to place those. So it's another component that you can utilize to break out how you want to view the data. So when you start going in and looking at the throughput, like we were just discussing, what is the throughput for those real high value items? And I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Dan, or not, but totally up to you.
One of the things.
Move on to.
No, you're good. One of the things, just real quick, that we went through as we were talking through this presentation earlier, is one of the things that we also want to do is, it's not always just about what's the positive. You also, I hate to say you want to look for the negative also, but you want to look for those things that put you at risk as well. Those also have a value to them. So it's not just how do you take care of your high dollar items and those things that are going to slow you down, but if you don't have a process and way to capture, identify, and locate your trauma sets, for example, and make sure those are turned quickly, it opens up a lot of risk that's sometimes hard to put a dollar value on, but is a real thing. And I did just notice there was a comment around this. I think Warren added up about adding end caps to the storage areas for the high moving items. Absolutely, do that all the time. You want your high value, high target items right in front of you, so you can get to them quick. So yes, absolutely, that's fantastic.
Maybe add some candy bars in the checkout aisle, things like that.
Yeah, that's right, for some of us.
Catch your eye. But realistically, I've seen it really usefully put of like having some of the peel packs, things like that, just before the ortho rooms of what are consistently used. Yep. So just a little time check for us. We've got, I think we've got another like 10 minutes or so for presenting here before some Q&A. But our third objective is really continuous improvement. So not becoming complacent. Once you have these things in place, how do you keep your team moving forward with it? How do you establish some of your KPIs or key performance goals, and establishing your transparent, deliberate data review with them, balancing efficiency and safety metrics, kind of what we were speaking to before, and then sharpening your tools, which is just kind of looking at what other options are there out there on the horizon or current state based on your facility, your organization, that will make your team work better overall and accomplish these goals faster. And I think, like we discussed, having these things in place, having a baseline of data that you're collecting and evaluating, and doing that with clinical involvement and leadership's involvement is only going to create a better culture for you to request different things down the line. So if you need more staffing and they know that you are diligent in collecting the information and wanting it, they're going to be more trusting in your ability to request these types of tools. So before I go too long on that, we'll just start off with some establishing key performance goals. So this is really around setting staff expectations and getting some metrics in place that they understand how they're being measured and what they can work for on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's critical here, like the way to think about these things is in the form of lead and lag metrics. So a lag measure is essentially the result that you're hoping to achieve. So if you want less flash situations where you're having to use IUSS, whatever is going on at your organization that you want to tackle. What's the big goal that you want to tackle? And then working with your team to understand what are the measures that we can take within our department and within my specific space, whether that be Deacon TAM, whether that be in assembly or a sterilizer. What are some of the things that we're doing that ultimately impact that long goal? Is it double checking to make sure that the tags have been placed or that the QA check has been completed? Or is it making sure that every single instrument is clean in Deacon TAM, or things like that, of having that discussion with your team so that they can contribute? And the more that they're understanding and can contribute to those lead metrics that you can evaluate, that you can actually measure, is really critical overall, because then they have some stake in the game. And then also leaving that with them to say, hey, how do we improve upon this? What are some other lead metrics that we can be looking at and measuring that we can hold our teams accountable, that ultimately all go towards this end lag measure that is really the result that the clinical team and leadership team are probably looking for. So that's explaining those. Is there anything you want to add to that component, Dan?
Yeah, I'd have to say this is actually probably my favorite part of what we do when it comes to building a department. The reason why I say that is because I think naturally as humans, I think we have a tendency to be somewhat competitive. And a lot of times when we start talking about measuring and metrics and these kind of things, it typically comes across as a feeling of holding people accountable versus helping them improve. And my feeling is, this is the zealous part, I really like to develop culture. Everyone wants to be part of a winning team, right? And you can feel there's departments in a hospital or anywhere in life that you'll feel when there's an energy and a connection and people are growing and measuring, that it really moves a department to a whole different spot. They're noticed. Everyone wants to be part of a winning team. Right now, we recently saw the Super Bowl. You're wearing the jersey, you're painting your face, sitting out in 30-degree weather. Of course, that wasn't the case in this game, but people will do crazy things to be part of a winning team. And when you do this right, I can tell you that buy-in from your clinical customer, your C-suite, your vendors, when they see that you have a system that is running, you have accountability where it's needed, but accountability is lifting up those that need to be lifted up and trained to a process. It's hard to hold someone accountable to something you haven't trained them to or given them direction on. And so for me, this continuous improvement in culture, the data allows you to let them measure, and they don't necessarily have to be better than their neighbor, just better than they were yesterday, right? And it's those kind of things that I like to develop and pull into these huddles as we start talking about continuous improvement. I think that it changes the dynamic of your department, and people that are happy do better, cleaner, faster work. And so I just kind of want to, it's kind of a side note, it's kind of hard to measure, but I can tell you that for me, from my experience, that has had one of the greatest impacts, and being able to show them their improvement. It's visible, and everyone wants to say, look, I'm number one at this, right? So it allows them to showcase themselves a little bit. So maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I just wanted to throw that out there. That's kind of the way I love this area.
Yeah, no, I think it all goes towards the same end game. So if you have that lag measure that you can actually see the impact of these smaller tasks that are being done and measured that are going towards it and impacting it, is the end game that everyone's looking at for a scoreboard to see how their work is directly impacting it. And when they can see their own kind of stats from a sports reference, if you can see the stats that you yourself are putting up and see how this is impacting that lag measure that your team is working towards, it creates a lot more engagement. And so that's really where it comes down to reviewing that data with your team and getting that involvement. So discussing how would they adjust this measure, or what else would they like to measure. I think that's the beauty. It's definitely one of the challenges for sterile processing is there's not a whole lot of measurement, and productivity is measured in a bunch of different ways for these departments. But what can you do internally at your facility to begin to get that mind flowing of here's an idea of how we can make sure that every scope is clean or every one of these instruments is clean, and having your team members want to be involved with that is kind of the first step towards building that culture around that, and having those conversations with leadership on here's ideas that we're doing. anything innovative like that is going to really catch their attention and get that buy-in from everyone involved. So that's really where I go, incorporating interdepartmental leaders. They might even throw in new ideas of how they approach these things. And again, all of that goes towards building a better culture of when things do go wrong, that it's not a pointing their finger at he said, she said. It's how do we continue resolving this? What other metrics do we put in place to identify and improve our team overall? And next slide is not, there we go. So I think, we kind of spoke to it throughout this is making sure that, you're not just working on speed, making sure that those metrics and those lead metrics that you're looking at are impacting both the efficiency component, but as well as a safety metric. It goes without saying, I would think, but we got to throw it out there, make sure that you're considering, you don't want just everything flying through and getting up into sterile storage, but you want to make sure it's there safely and stacking it safely. So what kind of checks can you put in place to make sure that you're doing those things right? And I think those should absolutely be some of those lead metrics of reviewing maybe once or twice a week on, the stacking, how you have stacked, and making sure that everything has been stacked accurately. Checking the FIFO situation. You can do these things in bite-sized pieces, just checking a small sample of a section. Don't let the enemy of good be perfect. You don't have to go through the entire department. Everyone's kind of strained on time from a sterile processing standpoint. So how can you do something bite-sized that moves the needle and just gets the process going and gets that evaluation going, building towards that culture? Anything you'd want to add to that one, Dan?
No, I just find it interesting that I grew up hearing this, that you never have enough time to do it the first time, but for some reason you always have enough time to do it over if you did it wrong. So
yeah. It takes a whole lot longer then too.
Yeah.
And I know we're kind of getting up to the end here, but this is really kind of the last continuous improvement slide that we want to run through, is just ideas on sharpening your tools. So as you get more ingrained into evaluating the data and looking at the information that you're getting from a system or just from your manual collection, is how can you do these things more efficient, and what tools are available in 2022 that can help you with it. I think so much of the processes in hospitals is still manual. There's so much opportunity to continue improving that and setting that baseline of taking the initiative in your department and pulling some of the data manually, or as difficult as it is going to help you move the needle and getting more technology or more investment into your department, because you're able to set that baseline of these are the costs that are going into it. And that's where I think a lot of the challenging conversations come up when SPD wants something, is they can't quantify things. So the more that you've started this space and gone through the work of collecting it, it presents new opportunities for you to validate your wants of getting, RFID, machine vision things that are coming up, or if even things as simple as containers, and all those kind of go to safety that you can make an argument for, and then you can build a real business case around. Because I'm sure everyone, if you've gone up and had that conversation with leadership, is what's the business case for this? And if you have nothing to build on, it's really, really challenging. But its snowball effects is that you can start taking that data and present it to get more things that will help you be more efficient. So things like software integrations, how easy that makes your staff, helps with that throughput. More handheld computers and scanners, so you can say, I would like to get to another level of detail on my throughputs, see when things are actually getting onto the shelf, but we can't afford these things. And this would help us move the needle to make sure that we don't have any case delays looking for instrumentation, or even getting to the point where some space age stuff with computerized storage units. So there's more and more technology coming out, and if you don't have any information to help convey that to your leadership, you're starting from a really difficult point to make your business case for the budget for those things. I don't know if you've seen, I know you see a lot of the new technology out there, Dan. I guess, is there anything that excites you that people should be aware of, or how have you seen this used in this regard?
Some of these things are kind of there. The RFID is one that I get really excited about. It's kind of unique technology, but being able to track where your stuff is, we're always running, looking for it. And this will allow you to pinpoint it pretty quickly, identify what stuff is walking out of your hospital and into someone else's hospital. That kind of stuff allows you to track that, find where your stuff is going. I think that nowadays, as we come towards now as we're kind of coming to the end of this, I think one of the things that that's kind of common in the industry right now is we're being asked to do a lot more with less people and less stuff. And really the only way we can do this without burning people completely out is improving process, improving technology, and applying those things, having those two things work together to really allow us and give us find out where we can trim the fat, if you will, to be able to accomplish more with less, because I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon. I don't think they're going to go, never mind, let's double your amount of staff in your department. I don't see it happening. So we need to figure out how are we going to best, and as almost as an SPD industry, how are we going to move ourselves? How is our collective team going to move us to the next level and be able to deliver safely for our customers, but make it so that we love and enjoy what we're doing, help us grow to another level. Applying technology and these things really help improve and move us forward. So that's probably kind of my final argument on that. There's a lot of great stuff out there. And remember, it's an evolving technology. It doesn't always work perfect right out of the gate, but as we try it and build it, we improve on it. So that would probably be my ending comment to that.
Yeah. And I think it's like with any of this, you have to, it takes time to evolve and build and improve. And that's what we're doing on my side of the fence of trying to really help organizations get to that point. But it starts with, beginning to take your department seriously and evaluating it kind of from a scientific approach of how do we continue improving and measure it. And those measurements are critical, and setting these processes in place only helps your department become more legitimate and work better with the leadership and clinicians that you're supporting and making successful. Because it's the constant challenge and battle between sterile processing, and it feels like every other department in the hospital. I think this goes a long ways to legitimizing it and helping you be able to have more important conversations with everyone involved with that, and really illustrate what you're trying to say. Because I think, being in the weeds on that stuff, I've seen it, you can understand it, but conveying to the hospital leadership is a whole nother component and really an art form. But the more data and information that you have supporting you, it goes a really long way. So with that said, I want to open it up to Q&A for everyone and see if there's any interesting questions or ideas that we didn't cover, because this is, a really open space, and I want to share as much as we can from our side and get new ideas to potentially implement within our Sergio software or anything along those lines.
Well, Jeff, we did have a question come through from Sharon. She said that they've done consignment at their facility, and they now house 500 trays from 5 different vendors. And the big question I hear often, who is responsible for things when they go missing? Is it, since it's on consignment, is it the vendor who's responsible, or is it the hospital? And how long are we going to keep consignments? They say they have some trays that are 4 to 5 years old. What is your opinion?
Yeah. I did see that one. I think, you have to look at what's the consignment agreement look like. And there should be some specific language lined out in there, I would imagine. Otherwise, it really, kind of comes down to what the relationship is with that manufacturer and having that level of detail. So I don't want to go too far on it. Do you have any ideas on that part of it, Dan?
Yeah.
On who's typically responsible?
Yeah. So on the responsibility, it definitely comes down to the contract, right? There is a piece to this. So prior to me working with Sergio and doing what I'm doing now, I was on the hospital operations side. And there was one of the facilities, I won't disclose who or what, but we were spending around between $75,000 and $80,000 per month on lost instrumentation. And what was really interesting is that, and that's how I got to know Sergio, is we actually implemented their software. We actually forced the software system to track the trays as they came into the hospital, and they actually have to take pictures. And I can't tell you, I stopped counting how much money we saved, because we had trays that were delivered or the vendor actually brought it broken or damaged, and this is on ship-in trays too, but you pay for both. The stuff was already damaged, and it got up to the OR because most of your techs aren't going to know how that functions because they don't work with that instrument every day. They have to be able to clean it. But it was really interesting where I was able to pull up the pictures and say, actually, when you delivered this, this was the state. This item is not in this tray, therefore it's on you to do. Now, same thing with the consigned trays. You can also force that hand. And yeah, some is going to show that we lost it, some's going to show they lost it, but it just allows for an accountability, a simple way to hold them accountable to those lost instrumentation. Yeah. And then, our rule of thumb is if it hasn't been used, coming back to the data, if you haven't seen it go through your sterilizer in 6 months, it's time to make a phone call and tell them you're wasting valuable real estate. Get your stuff out of here. Replace it with stuff we need.
Yeah, and I think that it becomes more, taking a look at that data and saying, it hasn't been used in 6 months, talking with the vendors about it and making sure the surgeons are aware of what that decision is a critical component, because the vendor obviously should want that inventory to move elsewhere just as much as the hospital wants it out. Chances are the surgeon moved on and maybe someone forgot about it, but having the data to support it is a critical component. One other piece to that is being able to allow your vendors to reset the trays. So who's responsible for resetting those trays? Oftentimes is an individual facility decision. But I know within our system, we can allow the vendors to reset it. So you're getting their buy-in on that it's complete or not. And then if it's not complete, that's where you start having a conversation. Where did it get lost at? But they need to be catching it at that point of when it's getting reset.
Okay, now what data points? What data points would you make public to share with SPD staff? Any concerns about competition or embarrassment in posting too much individual measurement?
So that one, I can jump on that one, having been on the hospital operations side. So that one can be sensitive. You have to be careful. I had some departments that said absolutely, as a collective group, they said, we want you to post our specific numbers. Most of the time, you're not going to find that. So usually we did it by shift or collective group, or we just said, hey guys, we're measuring from here to here, our throughput as a department, and then we rewarded based on that. And everyone contributed to that. So that is a very, I didn't see who, I apologize, I didn't see who posted that question, but you are right. That is sensitive. I would have that be, as you're building your team unity, pull them together and say, hey guys, how would you guys like to measure? Typically those that do less prefer less measurement. I'll just say that out loud.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with that. I obviously coming from the industry side, that information is widely available for our from a sales perspective, and there's different mentalities you have to take into mind. I'm not suggesting that that's the all-time best way of doing it, but I think the more approach that you have that is collaborative with all of your staff, it becomes more of a rah-rah type thing, because it's lifting each other up. All ships rise if there's buy-in on what the end goal is and how we're trying to measure it. And if they're upset about something, making sure that they've had the voice to speak to how they might want to change that thing. Because most of the time, if people are underperforming, they're complaining that something isn't fair or not in their favor. And if you have that open conversation of how they might make these things better, you either find a new way to measure it that might actually be better, or B, you kind of are able to kind of squash that concern that they have, and they can't argue against it. And if you have that buy-in, it's a critical component. So I'm definitely in favor of making that information available so that there is more of a conversation around it. If you just leave that down, they're not accountable to it, or they aren't able to hold their peers up to the same level, you kind of lose that culture approach. But I think it's a careful balance, and you have to lead it the correct way.
Yeah, I saw Wendy's comment here too. She just said that they assign a pseudonym, Alpha, Bravo, etc. So individual productivity is posted and people can see where you are in some areas, but it's anonymous. I think that's a nice blend of really giving that recognition or assessing productivity, but keeping it sensitive, I guess,
yeah.
too.
Yeah, we did that where we assigned a code name for everyone, and they're the only ones that knew their code name. Yep, I've done that too.
And that's nice. That's a good way, I think, to walk the line there. But we have come to the end of our hour. Thank you, Jeff and Dan, for a great discussion and for providing key data review strategies for SPD storage success. We didn't get to every question. We'll make sure that the questions get to the speakers, or you can always reach out to them on LinkedIn or send them an email and get your questions asked or get more information. And there will be a short 15-minute break before the next session. But thank you for joining us today, and we will see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having us.